Okay, good morning. And I say good morning, I don't think there's anybody on the live Zoom link yet today, so hopefully people will be joining us, but if not, it should be available to you sometime Tuesday evening when I'm able to return to campus and compress it and upload it to YouTube, and so it should be available to you. We'll go ahead and get started. We're beginning week 9 now, so we're pretty much on track with where we need to be, which is a pretty good statement given the fact that we did lose some time we had a couple snow days and well, at least one snow day, I think. And so we're in pretty good shape. I just want to talk a little bit about the exam that we had last weekend. If anybody had any questions or problems with that, let me know. If you tried to email me yesterday, it was a really difficult day. I was here pretty much all day, but we had a new 7-week section starting up yesterday, and we were sort of moving around and juggling rooms and whatnot. So I didn't have a chance to look at my email, and I had a night class until I was here until about 9 o'clock last night. So I will be looking at those today. If you did have issues, technical problems, etc., with the exam, let me know, and we'll try to figure out what's going on together, and we'll try to resolve that particular issue. Okay, if there is an issue, and there may not be. Hopefully the format was, is conducive to your style and whatnot. It was, I think the time limit is certainly agreeable, 90 minutes for 40 multiple choice questions. Seems to be adequate for most people. And so hopefully that worked in your lives. Okay. All right. So for this week, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be moving into talking about some purely macro models from here on out. And we're going to be doing a lot of model building this week. In particular, today, we're going to be starting with the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. And that is, and I just barely opened the door to this last Tuesday when we were reviewing for the exam, prior to reviewing for the exam, when I had mentioned that we talked about the original demand supply model on the PQ plane and how that would be sort of the template for sort of blowing that up and is expanding it to cover the entire macro economy, and that's where we're going today. We move we'll probably get through this today. If we don't, we'll cover the rest of it on Thursday. I don't think there will be too much left over to cover, but we may some of chapter 12 may lead into next week. 12 and 13 are really theoretical pieces. I was looking this over the weekend, and one of the first things I noticed when I first adopted this text. And the reason, frankly, we adopted it was because it was free. So it doesn't get any better than that for students. Obviously, the price is right. Oh, you know what? My dates are totally wrong. I got 3-3. Today's 3-8, right? Well, I just noticed I'm totally out of whack here. So hopefully someone noticed that. So today's 3-8, 3-10, and then 3-15, 3-17. Yeah, that should be right? Jeez. I guess I didn't get enough sleep last night, having taught late last night. But anyway, that's my excuse at least. So the theoretical pieces, and they come in sort of a weird spot, I think, because usually I cover the theory part of the class toward the very end, after we've covered things like government policy and whatnot, and what government does in order to deal with macro problems. And so it usually seems to fit better. I don't know that this doesn't fit better, but it's just a strange place. And so what I'm going to do is when we talk about chapter 12, beginning on Thursday, I'm going to be sort of incorporating material that actually comes out of Appendix B, which was not assigned in the readings. You don't really have to read that, but it's good background information. And it does sort of lay the groundwork for much of what is known as Keynesian economic theory. It comes from the work of the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who really is sort of the godfather of macroeconomics. In fact, his major work was done during the Great Depression in the 1930s, really sort of in the middle of the Depression. He wrote really what is his seminal work called The General Theory, which sort of laid out the case that economies are not just simply collections of all markets together. In other words, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And by the way, the whole has characteristics that the individual parts do not. So for instance, individual markets might deal in money, but no individual actor, whether it's a business firm or a household, has really any control over the supply of money or the price of money or anything like savings or anything that has to do with government for that matter, whether it's budget issues like spending and taxation. They really have nothing to do with the exchange value of currencies. That is one currency in relation to the other. But we're going to come back to that a bit later in the class. There's another international piece a bit later. And so what Keynes was arguing was that economies are more complex than simple aggregations of markets taken together. So one of the things that we should know about macro, and I think I may have mentioned this early on, is what differentiates macro from micro, among other things, is the idea that macro sort of sprung out of micro beginning around the 1930s. In fact, the term macroeconomics didn't even exist until sometime in the 1940s. And it was probably around after Keynes himself had died, I think, is when the first usage came about. So if you had taken an econ course in 1932, for instance, it would have probably looked a lot like micro, and whatever discussion of government there was would simply try to incorporate micro principles into that. Whereas now I think we all have a better understanding of how macroeconomies work. And the evidence for that is the fact that we've had some really serious financial and economic problems in the last few years that the economics profession was able to really resolve pretty successfully. I mean, the 2007-2008 financial crisis, which was a pretty big deal and really threatened to bring down the entire banking system in this country, probably would have done so had it been 100 years earlier, when neither financial actors or economists or government actors knew what to do about a situation like that. And now they do, and they acted with great speed and resolved the problems to the point where now not too many people really talk about it, but it was a very serious situation. And we've had a number of those situations. And I think I've told the class before that we think of depressions now as being this thing way in the distant past. And let's hope that it's all in the distant past. But we've had some very serious, not just recessions, but depressions throughout most of the 19th century periodically as they arose, oftentimes due to something breaking down in the economy, oftentimes dealing with the financial sector, which is why it deserves special regulation. And we'll come back to the financial part of the economy a bit later. Okay, so when we talk about the theoretical piece, we're going to present Keynes's theories and what he was trying to get at, and then we'll talk about some of the shortcomings of those, and in particular the reaction to those by who are called the Neoclassicists. And so if you're thinking, well, who are the classicists if there are Neoclassicists out there? Well, the classicists are really the original theorists who first devised the theories of economics. And they go back to really the 18th century, and mostly British and French economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Jean-Baptiste Say, and others, Jeremy Bentham. And you could even include in this Karl Marx, actually, as strange a grouping as that might sound. But nonetheless, they all had sort of a similar idea as to how markets worked and how, therefore, economies worked as a result of the interactions of individual markets. And the term classical itself was actually coined by Keynes to really say that everybody who came before me was wrong, and we're going to sort of lump them all together. That was a pretty audacious statement that he made. But and so the classicists of today sort of now call themselves neoclassicists, and they have sort of got a particular variation on some of the original themes of economics, free markets and limited government intervention, and the right of free actors to produce freely and to make the kind of products that firms want to make and consumers to buy the goods that they want to consume, and free of government, excessive government control. So that's really the debate which we're going to be laying out beginning on Thursday and continuing into next week. And then after that, we get into some policy pieces where, and whenever in macro we talk about policy, we're almost always talking about government policy, because government really is the only actor that can deal with macro problems, just because of the fact it's too big for any one private actor to deal with. That hasn't always been the case, because we had a condition in 1907 which really required the intervention of a strong government that was not strong and did not know what to do, and the actions of the banker J.P. Morgan, the man, not the name of the firm, which still exists today, but the guy, JP Morgan, who basically got the bankers of New York City together and said, this is what we're going to do to fix these particular problems. They were financial, real banking problems. And today we do not want that sort of situation where private actors are dealing with public problems. So that's really the debate. And the debate centers really around the role of government, frankly, if you want one to put it in a nutshell as to what the debate centers around is what should government be doing? And again, the word should then implies a normative economic statement. Government should do this, or government should not do that. And remember, the word should implies a subjective judgment, depends upon who is holding the view and what they're trying to advocate for. And it really sort of delineates then which of these two schools of thought economists will fall into. Okay, so that's where we're heading in the class right now. And so we're over the halfway mark and moving into, I think, some interesting discussions. Certainly, we've talked about inflation, and inflation is the big story for right now. We will, as we get into chapter 13, we'll hear a lot more about the neoclassicists' concerns over inflation and criticisms of them over Keynesian's seeming apparent lack of concern for that. So, but before we do that, though, we want to talk about some of the basics of economic modeling. And one of the things that I ended up talking about before we did the review session for the last exam was this. If you go back to the very basic market model we've been talking about quite a lot now up to this point, excuse me, we've got a demand curve that's downward sloping, and we've got a supply curve that's upward sloping, looking something like that. And they together form some sort of equilibrium condition. And again, equilibrium is manifest in two ways. That is, the two axes by which you could drag these, whatever this point of intersection is. So we simply refer to that as equilibrium quantity. This is an individual market for some good, whatever it is. This would be a microeconomic model, okay? What we've been talking about way back in chapter 3. And then equilibrium price, which we call market clearing price. And what did we say about equilibrium way back in the day in chapter 3? It seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? We said that equilibrium was this condition of balance, this condition of short-term relative balance in a market as to price and quantity. And it's manifest in terms of price and quantity. And so whenever we have an equilibrium condition, we usually put a little asterisk by the variable in question. And then we usually pronounce it as Q star or P star, denoting the fact that it's some sort of balance condition, but that this balance is not permanent, because one of the things about economics that we have to always keep in mind is the idea that really nothing is nailed down. Everything is moving. We can't just super glue something like demand down and say, stay put, don't move, because it's going to move, and it's a motion picture, and it's moving all the time. And that's really the trick behind economics, is to find out where things are going, so that if you're, particularly as a policymaker, a macroeconomic policymaker, you know where the economy is heading, so that you can enact policy to try to deal with whatever might be coming. And I have talked endlessly about this idea of inflation and how it looks like, I will speak for myself, and when I do speak for myself only, I'll say it's my opinion only, and I don't expect anybody to try to adhere to my opinion. If you have a different view, then we're all human, and that's perfectly fine. But I've been of the opinion that our government is very much behind the curve in dealing with the inflationary pressures which the economy has been experiencing. I know that they've been saying now for several months, and when I say they, I'm talking about our Federal Reserve, which is our central bank, much more on them later, and our Treasury, which is part of the administration. They've both been saying that these inflationary pressures are transitory. That's the word that they've been using pretty consistently. In other words, saying these are temporary. They'll go away once these kinks in the supply chain get worked out. That is this idea of we work out these problems of getting goods shipped from overseas, where we get enough dock workers to unload the ships as they're coming in. We have enough truckers to move the merchandise. We don't have enough of any of those. There's a big labor shortage. Probably COVID driven. COVID is the culprit here, and there's no doubt COVID is a huge contributor to it. But the idea that it will work itself out, I think, was sort of a fantasy to a lot of us. And in fact, last week, the Federal Reserve Chairman himself came out and said, yeah, I think we were wrong. I think we are behind the curve, meaning that they're going to be very aggressive starting very soon, like next week, literally next week, at trying to deal with these inflationary pressures that are facing the economy at the moment. And so we will probably see interest rate increases. If you haven't refinanced your house yet, it's almost too late probably, but you know, if you have a house, if you don't, you know, whatever. But and actually sometimes, I know when I was in the banking business, sometimes the Fed would raise rates and mortgage rates would actually fall because those are long-term rates. And the interpretation would be that, well, the Fed is serious about inflation. So the long-term expectation is there won't be inflation, so we don't need higher rates at this very long stage of things. So sometimes that's the way the market reacts. Right now, though, there are way too many uncertainties going on in the global economy with the war in Ukraine and the issues with pretty much the entire world trying to shut down Russia's economy, which is Russia is a big producer of oil and natural gas. And the market for oil and natural gas is a global market. So any kind of restriction there is going to pop the price up. I was really busy yesterday. I didn't have a chance to look at it, but I know that on Sunday night, I looked at the futures market for oil and it was over 125 a barrel, 124 a barrel, which is the highest I think I've ever seen it ever. So I don't know what it is now. I guess I could pull it up here and find out what actually I want to do that just to, now that I'm curious and want to see what it is. My point is though that there are some different kind of conditions right now which is going to make the Federal Reserve's job a little bit more challenging, and that's 120, it's 126, almost 127 a barrel. That is a big dollar figure. No doubt higher gas prices are on the way. So the Fed is probably going to move to try to shut down some of the consumer spending and in order to bring down inflation. And that's going to hurt some people, no question about it. It does happen. In fact, every interest rate increase that we've seen since World War II has resulted in a recession. So that's probably around the corner. That's not particularly good news for the president. But one of the things that the Federal Reserve has, at least in past years, has prided itself on is not being swayed by political considerations along those lines. I think my closed captioning is working, so I'm not able to see myself, so I'm kind of looking over here a lot just to make sure that I've got the camera in the right place. I guess I do. So because I've got something across the some kind of wording across the thing there. But anyway, the point is that when we talk about economic modeling from a macro perspective, we really start with something that looks very similar to this. But the problem is that this is really an inadequate model in itself to describe the macro economy. And this brings us back then to the idea of why macro exists in the first place. And it's the idea that microeconomics explanations for macro problems are insufficient. That in reality, what we've really got going on here is something bigger. And so we need to incorporate more factors than simply the demand and supply for a particular good and the price of the quantity at which those particular goods clear any particular market. Remember, any kind of a market could be as small as the market for tennis shoes in Northwest Albuquerque between Eagle Ranch and Coors and Montano and whatever, Paseo, right? I mean, you could box in any kind of a market as small as that. You could expand it like a Russian doll, right? It kind of grows, and you can zoom in, zoom out. Well, in macro, we're talking about the entire economy. Okay, so one of the things that we should talk about with regard to macroeconomics is that we will deal with not just demand for any good or service like tennis shoes in the market for tennis shoes in Northwest Albuquerque, but aggregate demand, which is demand for all goods and services in the economy at a given time. And then we talk about supply, we're talking about something called aggregate supply. Now, these are both sloped the same way for the most part, right? And I've got these as sort of linear looking, but you know, they could be, they're probably more curvy than they are linear, but you know, that's not a major problem at this point. So what does aggregate demand represent? If you look at the PowerPoint packages I emailed to everyone earlier, aggregate demand refers to all goods and services in the economy at a given time, and all the aggregate supply for those goods in the economy at a given time. Okay, so, and one of the things that we're going to differentiate here, well, a couple of things is, first of all, aggregate supply, we're going to say, well, first of all, aggregate demand is downward sloping, okay? Well, the two differentiating things we'll be talking about is, first of all, aggregate supply is upward sloping, but we're going to say it's upward sloping in the short run only. So we're going to say the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. And I can't recall offhand whether or not it's denoted the same way in terms of the symbols in your text, because sometimes it'll be listed this way: short run aggregate supply, or aggregate supply with sort of an SR subscript like what I've done here. It's the same thing. It's the very same thing. It's upward sloping, but in the short run. Now, the question is, what is the short run? When does the short run end and the long run begin? And I'll give you an economist's answer, which is probably not going to be very satisfactory. And that is, it really depends. And it depends upon what all the conditions are by which we know that something has happened to make the short run no longer the condition that it once was. In other words, when things have changed so much in the macroeconomy that we know the short run condition is now gone and we're into something new. In other words, we kind of know it when we see it. That's maybe not a very good answer. And unfortunately, in micro, we tend to have a more concrete answer for the short run. In macro, it's a little bit more squishy. So we plead guilty to being a little bit wishy-washy on that subject. Okay, so that's one differentiating factor from the micro model. The other differentiating factor is this. When we talk about P, we're not talking about the price of any individual good like tennis shoes. We're talking about the price level existing in the economy. And it's usually based upon some index. Well, it is based on some index. And it's oftentimes something like the consumer price index, which is as we talked about back in chapter 9, the index that tracks consumer prices, that is prices for retail buyers of goods, and it contains a market basket of goods that go into that, and it simply tracks them and compares them to the prices of those same goods in some base year, like say 2005, and we compare those to know what the inflation has been every year since that particular base year. Those base years are revised over time, mostly because of the fact that number one, the market basket changes, new goods come along, and some goods go away. For instance, I don't think that I can't recall, but I don't know if iPhones and smartphones were around in 2005. I don't think that they were actually. So those would probably be a pretty important addition to the market basket, given the fact that most of us have one of those two particular styles of cell phone. And then some goods simply go away because they're no longer needed, no longer viable, like MP3 technology. I know it's still around, but it's not, like on Walkman and things like that. So you get the idea. But the price level is based upon some index. It could even be the GDP deflator. That's a very commonly used one for a P. And when I say that the P, we're talking about the price level existing in the economy that's based upon some 100 index, and it goes to say 105, 110, whatever. And 100 being the base value, and everything goes up from there. And which makes our comparisons easier when we look at 100, because if the index value is 127, then we know that the prices, whatever it is we're analyzing, and if it's the consumer prices, it's 27% increase since the base year comparison. And then we can compare it to the prior year to find out what it has done in that last year. Now, the CPI, the consumer price index right now, is running at about a 7% annualized rate. That's just basically taking the individual months and saying, okay, if this happened every single month, this rate of increase, it's because it's computed on a monthly basis. But if we said, okay, it continues all year long, we'd be at about a 7% annualized inflation rate. And the producer price index is actually coming out even higher, and which tells us that that some sellers are actually holding back on price increases to buyers because they either feel like they can't pull off those price increases, buyers won't pay for them, or they want to just wait and see before they change prices. So it's an interesting situation we're facing right now. This inflation is not as transitory as what was believed. So P here refers to price level. And instead of Q here, we're simply going to go to the Y, which is the GDP Y, which we've talked about before. So Y now is GDP, and this then becomes equilibrium GDP. Equilibrium GDP. And there's going to be much more on this on Thursday when we start talking about the Keynesian model and what this really means. And there's some discussion that I think is a little bit too technical in your book about the connection between savings and investment, but we will try to bring it back, or I'll try to bring it back in as easy a way as possible on Thursday. And when I say bring it back, I'm just simply trying to simplify it and make it as comprehensible as possible, given that discussion. But equilibrium GDP is basically this short-term state of relative balance of GDP. And then the price level, if we have relatively stable prices, this is the equilibrium price level. And frankly, for the better part of the last 40 years, we have had fairly stable prices, particularly at the consumer level. Even considering the fact that we've had big spikes and dips in the oil price, and hence the gasoline price, big spikes and dips in things like natural gas, big ever rising increases in healthcare costs, almost never ending, they just continue to go up and up. But overall, though, taking all goods into consideration, the price level increases have been less than 2% for most of the last 20 years at least, and then certainly less than 4% for most of the last 40 years. It's only been just recently, and I think it probably did begin with a supply shock, given the fact that we just did not have enough workers and enough supply mobility to sort of move the goods for which there was demand. And so prices of goods went up, and they're continuing to go up. Now, if you add to that the issue of oil prices that are just really sky high and elevated, it's going to be an extra double whammy to the economy. And so I do think we've got some pretty shaky economic times ahead. I don't think any way around it because of that. And I don't know what the end point is of this war in Ukraine. Without getting into the details of that, it is certainly causing lots of mayhem in the macro realm. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything so far that I've been talking about. Well, let's take aggregate demand first here. Talk about why aggregate demand is downward sloping. Okay. So in your PowerPoint package, I've talked about three different factors by which aggregate demand is downward sloping, and it's really intended to. I think maybe there's another one in your text that they talk about, but these are for right now. I think a good starting point, and it's important to realize that it's not just, well, hey, what would you expect a demand curve to look like, but downward sloping? Isn't that what we've been learning, for the whole time now, is that demand is a downward sloping function. So why wouldn't aggregate demand be downward sloping? It's a pretty good point. However, there are some other considerations that need to be taken into account, and that they're macro considerations, and that they would affect really the slope of aggregate demand. And by the way, the same rationale of what would you expect a demand curve to look like downward sloping, and what would you expect a supply curve to look like as upward sloping, that same rationale would not apply to supply, because there's a reason why we talk about some short run aggregate supply, because it will differ from the long run. So that particular sort of stretching of the micro model to include to sort of explain the macro configuration isn't particularly useful. But let's talk about what are some of the issues there. And they all really revolve around this issue of price. And the first of these is called the real balances effect. And it really has to do with purchasing power. And so if you think about what is going on here, if the prices of goods are going down, then it means that buyers have more purchasing power and they can buy more goods. So as a result of buying more goods, sellers are willing to provide more goods. And as a result, GDP grows as a result. Isn't that what growth in GDP is? More people buying and selling? Isn't that sort of the goal of that particular situation? So this is why stable prices are considered to be a desirable thing. But if the price level goes up, then it means our purchasing power goes down. Remember, one of the things that is very important that we talked about with regard to inflation, and was that people's incomes don't catch up with inflation right away. And almost nobody's income catches up with inflation right away, which is why inflation is considered to be a very serious thing. And remember, one of the very last points that we made before we sort of wrapped up that second part of the class, before entering into the second exam, was that the central conflict in macro policy is between trying to manage between these two dangers on either side of the road. If you're driving the car, there's the macroeconomy. You've got inflation on the one ditch is inflation, the other is unemployment. And so which way do you kind of steer? And which ditch would you rather be in, the unemployment ditch or the inflation ditch? Now, the answer is neither, of course. If you said neither, that's the right answer. But then the question is, which is the worst one to be in? And that's a difficult question to answer because it's sort of subjective. And it also is a difficult one for anybody to answer because it's like, you know, even an economist who says, well, I'd rather have inflation than unemployment, or I'd rather, or maybe even worse, I'd rather deal with unemployment than inflation. That might be easy for them to say if they're employed. They're not the ones who were laid off on their job at a factory or in a company that's closed shop and left town or whatever. So I get that argument. You know, that's easy for somebody to say, you know, particularly when it relates to unemployment. So in terms of the question, which is worse, inflation or unemployment, it's really hard to know. But remember, the key thing to know about inflation is the fact that as prices are rising, people's incomes don't catch up. Almost nobody's, because remember, inflation data is computed on a monthly basis, and it's just simply not possible for you to every month, if you see the consumer price index went up by 1% last month, to go into your boss's office and say, look, here at the newspaper, prices went up by 1% last month. By all rights, I really should demand a 1% increase in pay in order to compensate myself for the 1% loss of purchasing power that the rising consumer prices has caused me. So can I please have a raise? I very seriously doubt you're going to be welcome with open arms in that discussion, particularly if you do it every single month. And it's a difficult proposition because workers don't really have the ability to do that. Even those workers who are covered under collective bargaining agreements sort of lock in those agreements ahead of time, not really knowing what the inflation rate is going to be. So maybe they anticipate something like well, I mean, if you locked into an agreement a couple of years ago, anticipating that 2% inflation would be the norm. And in fact, I don't think a lot of people saw this inflation coming because inflation's been so under control for so long. Well, if you'd been in a collective bargaining agreement a couple of years ago, locking in for, I don't know, X number of years, well, then those members who are covered in that are going to really lose purchasing power because of that. So as a result, they're going to demand less real output. And when we talk about GDP here, what we're talking about is real GDP, that is inflation adjusted GDP. Okay, so it's an inflation adjusted GDP. Sometimes you'll see this as nominal GDP, and sometimes, you know, but this is always going to be price level, but this is for the most part real GDP. So you're demanding less output in the economy if your real purchasing power is going down. The real balances effect, refer to real balances of what? It's real balances of money. Your money goes less far during inflationary conditions. And so this is what makes inflation difficult. And I think probably most economists would say, when faced with that question that we posed last time, and it's not the last, it's not the final condition, not the final instance in which we'll bring it up, but in faced with that question, which is worse, inflation or unemployment, I think most economists would say inflation is the bigger problem. And the reasons why are among the reasons we talked about back in chapter 9, is that once it gets going, it becomes really difficult to stop it, because the main means to stop it means to basically hit the brakes on this car, to slow things down so that we can sort of deal with it, squeeze out any excess pricing power that firms might have. I know that there are some people are accusing firms of trying to gouge the public and trying to get away with some of that. Some firms are saying that, or some critics I think are saying that firms are taking advantage of people who are getting a lot of public support at the moment because they're more indifferent to prices, given the fact that they're on so much public support that it's quote unquote not their money. I don't know. I mean, those are voices that you hear. There's no question, though, the fact that people's purchasing power is eroded, and it's not just simply a question of sellers who are trying to gouge the public. No doubt there are, we're trying to get away with it. But that word gouge is not really used by economists very much because it's sort of the way the world works. If you can charge a higher price for something, charge a higher price for something. And I mean, even something like restaurant meals, it's even like fast food meals. I don't do a lot of fast food, but my son does, and I'm trying to encourage him not to do that because I am looking at the price of those. It's really it's pretty shocking, actually. So yes, we've got inflationary conditions going on. So because of that, our real balances have less purchasing power when the price level is going up. So we demand less, which brings down GDP. If we demand less, suppliers are going to supply less, and GDP falls. This will probably happen of its own accord anyway. It will, I think, be certainly aided by our Federal Reserve, which is going to act here in just a few days to try to slow things down. They'll probably raise interest rates by 0.25%. That's what the sort of consensus is. But they'll probably keep doing it as many as 7 times this year. So if you've got a loan that's a variable rate loan, it's probably going to go up by, well, 0.25% times 7, which is 1.75%. Depending on how yours is structured. A lot of mortgages are set up with it's like a fixed for 7 years, then it goes variable, or I mean, there are all kinds of different arrangements out there, or it's capped and it'll only move 1% a year or whatever. That sort of thing. To the extent that people here have mortgages. I personally, as an ex-banker, I haven't had a variable rate loan in, I can't even tell you when. I'd rather just know what it is and be fixed with it. And I'm glad now that my mortgage is on a fixed rate. Okay, so the real balances effect is one explanation for that, sliding up and sliding down depending upon the price level. The second of these really relates to the price level also, and it's the interest rate effect. Now, we haven't talked much about interest rates yet, but we will. So if we think about this, then what is the interest rate? Okay. So I think we all know what an interest rate, the interest rate, which is considered I here, is basically this. It's the rental cost of money. This is the formal sort of academic definition. It's the rental cost of money expressed as a percentage. Okay, now you all know what an interest rate is, I'm sure. But when we talk about the interest rate, this is a formal definition, the rental cost of money expressed as a percentage. And I know that when economists talk about the interest rate, it's a little bit confusing and maybe even a little bit misleading to some, because people will say, what do you mean the interest rate? There are all kinds of interest rates. There are interest rates on credit cards that are different from interest rates on student loans, which are different from interest rate on car loans, which are different on rates paid to depositors for savings accounts and CDs and things like that. So yes, that is true, but all of those are, in fact, the cost of using someone else's money and paying a percentage for that, and then using it somehow in order to get a hopefully bigger return on that particular money at some point. So every saver is actually a lender. So if you save money, this is one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, but if you save, you're typically saving through a financial intermediary. So now obviously you could save money by putting it into your mattress or stuffing it in a coffee can and burying it in the backyard. And I guess that to you, that would be savings. To the macroeconomy, it's simply money that's left the system because it doesn't exist anymore. It's no longer active. It's just part of the money supply that is not moving around. So we know it's there, but it's probably not anyone's individual coffee can. It's probably not going to be raising alarm bells in Washington or whatnot. But the point is that it's not true savings from a purely economic standpoint, and that is that money in savings is deposited with a financial intermediary, whether it's a bank or whether it's an insurance company, a mutual fund, a stock investment, a bond investment, a mutual fund, any number of these exchange traded funds that are out there. They tend to be deposited somewhere in the financial world. And so because of that, because they're deposited somewhere in the financial world, why does somebody save? What is someone's motivation for saving money? Now, by the way, this is an important aspect of what Keynesian economics seeks to address, and that Keynes himself talked about back in 1936, was the idea of what motivates somebody to save money. Why would you save money? If you get a paycheck and you get $500 a week as in a paycheck, why don't you just spend it all? What's the point of saving any of it? Well, obviously, we would like to save for, for maybe just to be able to spend later. Obviously, I mean, I don't need to tell you what the reasons are for why people want to save. A down payment on a house, to save for education, to save for your children's education, to save for a new car, whatever the case might be. There are a lot of good reasons. Retirement savings is a big one, but it's the idea of putting money aside so that it can be used at some future date. Okay, in other words, it's what we call deferred consumption. So people save because they want to use it later, but they want to get some rate of return, some I, that is the rental cost of money expressed as a percentage. So they part with it now in order to get it back later, but in the meantime, get paid some sort of rate of return. And sometimes they don't get it right away, they get it maybe later, but they get compensated for that. As a result, everybody who's a saver is actually a lender from the perspective of, particularly when it comes to bank deposits. Every time you make a bank deposit, what happens is, to you, it's an asset. It's in the strict accounting definition, an asset in the accounting world is anything which is owned and which has future service value, which a bank deposit would be to every depositor. But to the bank, it's a liability being a claim on something that is owned, a claim that has got to be satisfied in the future, a claim against that particular party. So the bank records a liability for you, and you better hope they consider a liability so they do pay it back to you. And then obviously they pay you an interest rate, albeit not a very great one at the moment. In fact, banks have been very sly about not passing along any higher interest rates to savers in the last, 20 years or so. Not that rates have been really that high anyway, anywhere in terms of, either for borrowers or savers. But savings in banks has been very problematic in banks. And banks aren't even shy about what the reasons are. They don't want to pay it. They don't see the reason why they should pay high interest rates on it. Now it'll be interesting to see what they do as rates begin to pop up, which I think they will. Will they drag their feet on raising deposit rates? We'll see. I think they probably will, to be honest with you. And we'll see what the response of savers is on that subject, because I think that a lot of people have most of their money outside of banks now anyway, given the fact that the stock market has been outstanding for the last, number of decades, and bank deposit rates have been puny and haven't even really caught up with inflation as small as inflation has been. So not even close to catching up with inflation. So you get the idea that savers are losing money. So when we talk about the interest rate effect as being part of the explanation for the downward slope in aggregate demand, what are we talking about here? If the cost of borrowing is high, that means that we're going to demand less output. So it's like the real balances effect. And again, I mentioned all three of these attributes are really centered around the same thing, that is dealing with the inflation or deflation of the general price level throughout the economy. So if the interest rate, the price of money, in other words, being just another particular price. And so if the price of money is going up, we'll demand less output. And as a result, we will buy fewer homes. Businesses will buy less equipment. They'll buy less inventory. Builders will build fewer homes, all because of the fact that interest rates have risen, which means that fewer people are going to qualify for financing, because as it becomes more expensive, fewer people qualify. And we do see this happening when interest rates go up. At bankers, and I'm an ex-banker, I can tell you that they do tend to look a little bit less leniently at loan requests, particularly on close calls. And that includes business loans as well. And so as a result, it slows the economy down, which is what the Federal Reserve is probably trying to do here in order to squeeze inflation out. The idea being that once inflation goes away, maybe we move this direction then, and they can ease up on the interest rate mechanism. But we'll see, we're not there yet. We're only we're in early days of that. But likewise, if the interest rate is falling, then people demand more output. And by the way, we've had such low interest rates throughout this entire century so far, the entire 22 years of the 21st century, that we've had lots of aggregate demand and lots of growth. A lot of it's been attributed to very low borrowing costs. and certainly on things like mortgages and autos and whatnot. Less on things like credit cards, which tend to be still priced pretty highly. It's just the nature of that particular product. It's always going to be priced a little bit highly. And so as a result, you get the idea, but as the rate comes down, people demand more GDP as a result. Okay, so it's very much related to the first one. And then the third one is the forward purchases effect. This again is related to the price level, but it's a little bit different. That has to do really with the value of currency. Now, we haven't really talked about currency much at all yet in this class, but it has to do really with the idea of who's buying our goods. Okay, so if in fact our goods become more expensive to foreign buyers because maybe our currency value is rising, then it means that it's more. If our currency is rising in relation to, say, Japanese yen, let's just take one currency. If our currency value, because currencies trade in values, you might have seen that. In fact, you might have heard on the news the last couple of weeks, the Russian ruble has been collapsing in value against the US dollar. Well, it's because nobody wants to hold rubles, because the Russian economy is I think the rest of the world is sort of trying to rig it to explode or implode or whatever you like. So nobody wants to hold rubles. And so when nobody wants to own anything, they do what? They run for the exits, try to sell. Any kind of selling pressure on anything puts the supply of that good on the market and brings the price of that thing down. So, and that's just a very recent example of this particular phenomenon. But our example of the dollar versus yen, if our currency is rising in relation to the yen, then it means the Japanese consumers will have to pay more in yen for the same dollar denominated goods. And so they'll demand less of that, because they'll do what? Well, they'll engage in the substitution factor, right? Maybe they won't buy a US made good, maybe they'll buy a good made in France or Australia or something, because of the fact that our currency is highly valued in relation to some other currency like the Australian dollar or the euro. And so as a result, our being able to sell less exports is a leakage from the economy, and we slow down, our economy slows down as a result. And we're going to come back to this idea of currency valuation a bit later, but this is something that we should talk about now, just so we have the foreign purchases effect squarely in our minds. Is that when we talk about a strong currency, that sounds great. Strong means good, right? All we're saying with the strong currency is that a particular currency is relatively more expensive relative to some other currency than it once was. So as a result, it takes more yen to buy dollars than it once did. So the dollar, we say, is rising against the yen. We say it's stronger against the yen, which sounds okay, strong. It's good. Now, it actually is good if you're a US person carrying dollars going to Japan, because you're buying cheaper yen to pay for things like hotel rooms and dinners and whatever you're doing in Japan, right? But if you're a Japanese buyer paying in yen, and somewhere it's going to have to be converted to dollars, it makes US goods more expensive. And so as a result, if that currency value is rising, then it actually is not a good thing for that balance of trade. It actually goes down. On the other hand, if the currency value is falling, everything is reversed. So if the dollar falls in value against the yen for whatever reason, maybe people don't like the prospects of the US economy and they'll favor the Japanese economy more, and therefore want to start owning yen so they can buy Japanese investments, Japanese goods, whatever. And as a result, the yen starts rising in value, then it makes Japanese goods more expensive and it makes our goods less expensive. And so US buyers buy more US output. Remember, Y is gross domestic product. We would buy more domestic made products and less Japanese made products, simply because of that currency valuation issue. So this brings us then to the question of, is strong good? Well, strong means that country that's got the quote unquote strong currency is going to have trade headwinds as a result. And by the way, this is one reason why countries have occasionally from time to time engaged in currency manipulation to try to bring down the value of their currency through a number of means that we won't get into here. The British did it a few years ago, and the rest of the world sort of talked them out of it. But it did help their trade picture. I know when President Trump was in office, he continually accused the Chinese government of manipulating its currency. And in all fairness, they probably were guilty of that a little bit before he took office, but probably not afterwards, because the evidence was strong that China was not manipulating their currency. But he really insisted that they were doing that. But be aware of the fact, excuse me, be aware of the fact that that can cause real balance of trade issues. Sorry about that. I'm getting over a cold here and still coughing a bit. Okay, so those are the determinants of why aggregate demand is downward sloping. And again, they all relate to the value, the price level, really, but different manifestations of it. Number one, it's not just the prices of goods, but it's also the price of money. And we really haven't talked about money. We haven't talked much about interest rates, just a little bit here. We'll talk more about interest rates later. And we'll definitely talk more about money as money a bit later. And we'll also talk even more about trade and imports and exports a bit later as well. So, okay, so questions for me about the configuration of aggregate demand and why it is considered downward sloping. Okay, well, just as the demand curve itself can shift, then we can also have shifts in the aggregate demand curve as well. So now we've been working from the PY plane, not the PQ plane, but the PY plane. So as a result, we've got a downward sloping aggregate demand curve we'll call AD1, and we've got an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And the reasons for the upward or the upward slope and then the short run derivation of this is going to become a little bit obvious when I talk more about aggregate supply. But what if, so we start with some equilibrium condition, and we'll call that Y1. A little star by that because that is in fact an equilibrium condition. And then there's some increase to aggregate demand where AD1 becomes AD2. So it's a rightward shift. And again, this is the very same methodology as before. A rightward shift is away from the origins increase. So as a result, there is an increase in overall aggregate demand. And as a result of this, it will tend to be an inflationary condition. We will talk much more about that, but a rightward shift is an increase in overall demand, and a leftward shift is likewise a decrease in aggregate demand. But what are these shifts due to? What are these shifts due to? What are the actual causes of these? I think it's important to know because they really, and I'll pick up on this on Thursday, I hope. I think it'll probably be Thursday. Well, they basically are this. They're the components of what aggregate demand are. And that is changes in C, I, G, and X sub M. So if you think about it, think about this, that if equilibrium GDP is equal to aggregate demand, which is equal to aggregate supply, then that's why it's in equilibrium, right? It's because the aggregate demand for goods equals the aggregate supply for goods. And so the demand for goods equals the supply of goods that are exchanged in the economy. And so that results then, the dollar value of those then is the equilibrium GDP. Okay, well then what is aggregate demand then? What are the components of aggregate demand? Well, the components of aggregate demand are C, consumption, I, investment, G, government spending, and X sub M, or the net effect of X minus M, that is net exports. X sub N, which is net exports. So let's take these individually, and we're going to be sort of working on these because these were sort of really broken out for us in the beginning, the early stages of the Keynesian model, which we're going to be talking about on Thursday. But the idea of different actors in the economy doing their thing, households, firms, and government, and then opening the economy to the rest of the world. So we're an open economy, not a closed economy. And so as a result, the difference between exports and imports become part of that. So that's really what aggregate demand is. And so any of these can therefore change aggregate demand, can shift it to the right as an increase or shift it to the left as a decrease. And again, we haven't changed anything with regard to the structural component of the first quadrant. Any movement away from the origin is an increase. Just think of the number lines, so think right, left here. Anything to the left is a decrease back toward the origin. So when we talk about these individual components, let's talk about change in consumption, which could be due to what? It could be due to changes in the income effect, right? Changes in people's incomes are a big determinant of consumer spending. And not only that, but also changes in their expectations. So income, wealth, and expectations is a big issue here. Expectations is a big one. And we're going to be coming back to this idea of expectations a bit later, particularly when we talk about neoclassical economics, which will be next week. I'm sure we'll be pushing that into next week. And that is, how do economies operate? And that is based, a lot of times economic actors, well, if you consider that the actions of the macroeconomy or the results of macroeconomic performance are the result of economic actors' performances, those performances are based upon what their expectations are. And so if you expect your income to go up, then you're going to spend more money because you feel more confident about the prospects for your own job and for your own income and your own security. And so as a result, the fact that you're spending money results in a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you and everyone else spend money, it's going to boost the economy, which is one reason why I can't think of any US president who has not tried to encourage people to spend money and to be confident and to take heart and to everything will be okay, hang in there, that sort of thing. I can only think of really one president in my lifetime, President Carter, who had sort of a downbeat mood at times, and it didn't augur well for his political fortunes. And so I think the lesson was very much learned by others, if it wasn't already known ahead of time. He was sort of a novice to politics, and it sort of showed in that regard. So presidents will always do that. And by the way, right after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, or soon after, President Bush was on TV and he wanted really people to not be afraid to fly. He wanted people to, and he also didn't want people to just sort of retreat in fear and hunker down, not spend money, not do anything. And so he encouraged people to go on vacation, take a trip, go to Disney World. And of course, he was criticized for that, but I understand what he was trying to do. He wasn't necessarily saying go to Disney World because I want you to all be in Disney World. It was just an idea. It was just the idea of don't hunker down and shelter in place forever, because you've got to spend in order to keep the economy going. If we all do nothing, it's not good. So because there was a lot of paralysis after that, particularly a lot of people didn't want to fly for some time after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So so you kind of get the idea. So expectations are a big issue there, but also income and wealth. We've talked a bit about income and wealth before and what those are about. Obviously, if incomes are rising, then it means you're going to be more likely to spend than not spend. And wealth is oftentimes the perception of wealth. Wealth is a little bit more difficult to get your arms around because you really don't know at any one time just exactly what your wealth is. Particularly people who own lots of real estate, it's really, really hard to know at any one time just what the value of your real estate holdings actually are. And I know that if you've got liquid assets, I guess you could probably pull up your bank account, pull up your 401k and whatnot, and it's sort of easy to tell. But if you've got lots of different sorts of investments sprinkled about, it's not exactly easy to tell what people have at any one particular time. So the wealth effect is really about how we feel. How do we feel about things? And so it's going to determine our consumption. When it comes to investment, we go back to this interest rate issue. And what the interesting thing about this is the connection between interest rates and investment. Now, we're going to come back to this a bit later, but right now is a good place to really focus on this. When we talk about I, that is the spending on capital goods by businesses. Remember, on the three categories: fixed investment, that's things like machinery and equipment and vehicles, things to be used in business to produce other goods, right? And also, that's fixed investment, also new construction of all kinds, with the exception of government. If a government builds an office building, that's part of G, not part of I. But if a business builds a new building, that's considered I. Or if a business builds a new house, that's I. Even though it's for household use, it's still constructed by a business, a builder. But here's the connection with interest rates. If the interest rate is going up, you can almost count on the big I going down. And if the little I is going down, the interest rate the investment is probably going to go up. This is a very, very firm relationship, and it's not the only relationship that impacts investment, because you've also got things like taxes and investment or in regulation and whatnot. And I mentioned some of that, particularly business confidence and whatnot. But that's a big one. The interest rate effect is a biggie. And in fact, the investment demand curve itself is usually plotted against the interest rate. And I'll show you that particular model a bit later, particularly as we bring in the entire issue of where investment sort of stands in its relation to the other elements of aggregate demand. Because where it stands is, and we've already mentioned this, but it's the most volatile piece of aggregate demand by far and away. It's the most volatile. And it's volatile because of interest rates, and it might be a little bit hard, particularly in the last, I don't know, even 20 or 30 years, when we look at very stable interest rates and say, yes, but interest rates don't explain changes in investment. Well, they don't, but it's a big and important determination of those, the cost of money. Because what is the thing that we said about investment, business investment, is that it's very much related to the interest rate, and it's very much like consumer durable goods. Remember, the durable goods portion of consumption, that they tend to be big ticket and often financed by borrowing. So therefore, they were interest rate sensitive also. Well, these are all big ticket items for the most part, and they're also often financed by borrowing, not always, but often. And so the borrowing cost is going to make a difference, no question about it. And there are other things as well, things like tax policy, things like regulation, trade policies, the policies that other countries are enacting. That's a big one in the international economic sphere. And at some point, maybe it'd be nice if we did an international economics piece here, course here. I think it'd be valuable to a lot of students, particularly those who want to do something in international business. I think it would go as a great compliment to whatever you're doing. If you are studying business, not everyone is studying business, but it would be a good compliment to that. Okay, so investment spending. We've already made the case when we talked about remember when we talked about GDP, we said that the expenditures approach, it was Y equals C plus I plus G. Well, remember, if aggregate demand is composed of these, then and Y equals aggregate demand, then Y equals C plus I plus G. So it's the same relationship. It's the same mathematical relationship. All we've done here is we've added aggregate supply, because we're saying at equilibrium GDP, there is no imbalance of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. This is what equilibrium GDP essentially is a balance between those. And all we're doing here is we're talking about what can cause shifts. And remember, this is sort of analogous to what we talked about when we said what can cause demand for a good to shift. Back in chapter 3, in talking about just some random good like shoes or tennis rackets or hamburgers or whatever, we said these are non-price variables. Well, here, these are non-price level variables that have nothing to do with the price level itself, but are outside of the price level mechanism. So they move independently of that. So things like, changes in consumption based upon things like wealth and income and business confidence or consumer expectations. Right now, consumers don't feel very good. I mean, we are seeing some consumer surveys. Consumer surveys are not particularly helpful or not particularly bright at the moment for obvious reasons. I mean, gas prices are through the roof. They're going to go higher, I think, and interest rates are going to go higher, no question about it. So and we'll see. And there's no end yet to COVID. So, gosh, I sound like an economist, don't I? It's a lot of bad news, but you get the idea. All of these are affected by things outside the price mechanism themselves that can affect investment spending. Okay. All right. I didn't mention on the PowerPoint slide. I probably should have. Things like taxes are an important one there, and regulation. I probably should have included that. I'll sort of make a mental note to do that a bit later. And then government spending. So government spending, I don't have anything to add there, because government spending is one of those elements that can be done independently of whatever. I mean, government does things for its own reasons a lot of times. And so it doesn't really seem to matter what government might engage in spending on. they'll do it for their own particular purposes, sometimes when the government wants to, and sometimes when it doesn't. And if you consider the impact of World War II, for instance, on the Great Depression, most economists and most ordinary people who have studied that particular era will say that yes, President Roosevelt's policies, which were influenced by Keynes, were somewhat helpful throughout the Great Depression of the 1930s. I mean, he was elected 4 times, you know, for gosh sake. So he must have been doing something right, you know, from that standpoint, because people often do vote their economic well-being. I think that's probably a good, you know, good starting point for that analysis. But you get the idea that World War II was something that was forced on the United States for the most part, that U.S. really tried to stay out of the war for as long as possible. But when engaged in it, government spending went up massively, so aggregate demand went up massively, and so did GDP. And that's really what ended unemployment in the Great Depression, was that. And which has led really an entire generation of people to say that what we need is a war when the economy has got lots of unemployment. And I think that that is probably a misleading interpretation of history in some way. It worked in that case because it was in a very severe depression, but it could easily be an inflationary condition if the economy is operating at or near full employment, as was the case during Vietnam. The Vietnam War, I think, is safe to say, was very inflationary. So an entirely different set of circumstances. Not that the wars were the same circumstances. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that or anything like that. But the economic circumstances were different. And so the idea that war is a good thing for the economy is it really sort of depends. And it's I don't know that that's the first thing that you would want to do, is that. Now we will talk about government spending, because it really is sort of the linchpin of what Keynes's prescriptions are for an economy that's in the doldrums. And he wasn't recommending go to war. He was recommending the government spend money on projects, things that are worthwhile, so that people could be put to work, and that the government could, in other words, jumpstart the economy. And then once the economy got going, it could run on its own. The government could step back, right? Kind of like a jump start of your car, right? When you have a dead battery. And that's sort of the idea behind Keynesian economics, is if households and businesses won't spend money, that is, won't create aggregate demand to boost GDP. And in fact, if it's going the other direction, which I didn't model leftward shift here, but I think you are able to figure that out, and the GDP is falling, then it's up to government to do the spending for it. But when we talk about the reasons for government spending, there are all kinds of reasons, many of them political, and some of them due to world events that really have nothing to do with economic issues at all. The COVID pandemic is a perfect example. The government has spent massive amounts of money on things like advanced tax credits for child tax credit, for things like these stimulus payments to replace lost wages, for the Paycheck Protection Program, all kinds of programs and relief efforts to try to stimulate the economy, to support private actors in the economy. And nobody planned that to happen. It wasn't done for political reasons. It just sort of happened, and government was there to step in. And I think we can be happy that government was there to step in, and that lessons have been learned since the Great Depression, because in the Great Depression, government was not there. And in fact, the government said, we don't want to get involved. And we'll talk a bit more about what some of the reasons were. I don't have quite the harsh view of the government as some do, because I think the government just didn't know what they didn't know. That's frankly what is the issue. And then the final issue is net exports. And net exports can be due, the changes in those are due to a lot of things, oftentimes due to these currency fluctuations that we talked about before. And currency fluctuations themselves are interesting for those of you who might follow currency valuations, maybe because you've got relatives living in a foreign country, and so you maybe travel periodically. That may have been restricted in the last couple of years, but I know a lot of people who have family overseas, and therefore are always looking at the currency valuation, euro to dollar, to find out what that is. It's been pretty stable, actually, but euro peso is a little bit more volatile over time. And the peso could be any collection of currencies, south of here, but Mexico, Argentina, etc. But there are a lot of currencies around the world that do fluctuate, and it is important to sort of keep up on that if you are traveling, or if you do business, then it's probably a more critical issue for businesses that do business overseas than individuals, because individuals can simply choose not to travel or choose not to buy imported goods if they want. I mean, that's entirely up to them. But businesses are sort of locked into what they're doing, and so currency valuations do matter a lot. But also things like trade controls. And I know that the world has been moving really since the end of World War II toward open borders when it comes to trade, and that is to take down trade barriers. And I really wish that we had more time to talk about this issue of removing trade barriers between countries. There was an effort underway called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which you don't have to write down necessarily, but which was really a series of formal meetings among member states to try to agree on a set of trade rules, that is to limit tariffs, that is taxes on imports coming in, to limit things like quotas, that is saying we're only going to allow X number of goods coming from this country into our country because it's going to compete against our domestic manufacturers. The idea being, let this be an open playing field. This is now formalized. The GATT has now become the World Trade Organization, which is a permanent organization. By the way, that was one of Keynes's prescriptions at the very famous 1944 Bretton Woods conference in New Hampshire, where once it became pretty obvious that the Allies were going to be victorious in World War II, they all got together and said, okay, now what do we do economically when the war is over? This was like August of 1944, after the Allies had made headway, and it was inevitable that Germany was going to be defeated, a little less inevitable that Japan was going to be defeated, but these are mostly European actors at the time. And the World Trade Organization was something recommended even then, but it wasn't really adopted until I think the 1980s. In fact, I think Keynes called the ITO, the International Trade Organization. We'll talk a bit more about his ideas next time. Okay? All right, so that's aggregate demand, and so we'll talk a bit more about aggregate supply next time. I think this is probably a pretty good stopping point. We've only got about a minute and a half left to go. So are there questions for me about anything that I've talked about this morning with regard to aggregate demand, aggregate supply, where we're going in the class, etc.? Trying to look over there to see if anyone's put something in the chat. And by the way, I can't hear you, and I've been saying for a long time that I can hear you, but somebody did something where I cannot hear students when because I had a class here last night and people were trying to talk to me, and I realized that I haven't been hearing a lot from people. So I think somebody muted it and I can't figure out how to turn it off. So we're just putting things in the chat box, which I can easily see from you. So, okay, well, if you do have questions between now and next class time, feel free to get with me. And otherwise, have a great day, and we'll see you next time.